Bear with me for a minute. This one's gonna wander. In the 4th century, when Saint Ambrose was Bishop of Milan and his brother Satyrus died, Ambrose wrote a eulogy that made some pretty miraculous claims. Satyrus had given up public office to manage Ambrose's affairs when he was named bishop, affairs that took him across the Mediterranean to Africa regularly. According to Ambrose, on one of these trips, Satyrus's ship had been dashed against some rocks, and while it was breaking up, Satyrus requested a communion host from one of his fellow passengers, wrapped it in a handkerchief, hung it around his neck, and then threw himself into the water, trusting in God to save him. Though in this same eulogy, Ambrose also mentioned that Satyrus was quite a strong swimmer. Anyway, this fantastic story contributed to the eventual canonization of Satyrus. And in the centuries to come, September 17th, Satyrus's birthday, would become the feast day of Saint Satyrus. In 1148, a document, still preserved in the archives of the Basilica Sant'Ambrogio, set forth the meal that would be served at this feast. 9 dishes over 3 courses are described, notably including something called lumbolos cum panicio, or loin with breadcrumbs. And this is the earliest known description of the breaded meat dish that would become cotoletta alla milanese. From cotoletta alla milanese comes the milanese of South and Central America and Mexico. From cutlet comes the tonkatsu of Japan and various other breaded cutlet dishes around the world. And if you ask many people, they'll tell you that cotoletta alla milanese is also the origin of Austria's Wiener schnitzel. According to an apocryphal story popularized by Felice Consolo in 1969's Guida Gastronomica d'Italia, while Joseph Radetzky von Radetz was in Italy for the Empire of Austria, a margin note from an adjutant's report made mention of a tasty breaded steak he'd sampled while in Italy. Upon Radetzky's return to Vienna, Emperor Franz Joseph I demanded that the recipe for this dish be provided to his chefs, and thus Wiener Schnitzel was born. Of course, it's not true. Nobody in Austria had heard of this story before it was published in Consolo's book. The specific adjutant mentioned does not appear to have existed. No evidence of the marginalia cited has ever been turned up. And most importantly, Radetzky did not take over as governor of Lombardy until 1848, while a recipe for Wiener Schnitzel appeared in print as early as 1831. Or at least a recipe for breaded fried veal called gebackene Schnitzel von Kalbsbraten, rather than Wiener Schnitzel. In fact, when the popular but extravagant practice of gilding food was banned in 1514 in Austria, the chefs there borrowed the breading and frying technique from Byzantine Jews to simulate that rich and golden coating they were missing. So, a miraculous Mediterranean shipwreck in the 4th century may not have led directly to the development of Wiener Schnitzel after all. But there is a direct link from the Austrian schnitzel to the Czech řízek, a schnitzel in all but name, made with pork for the most part. Řízek may not be the national dish of the Czech Republic, but it's so popular there that one page I read joked that you can tell who the Czechs are on a hike because they'll have a schnitzel or 2 in their backpack. Now, stereotypes like that are boring, lazy, and unfunny, yet every Czech řízek recipe I read online talked about taking schnitzels on a hike, or a trip, or on the school bus. Řízek is frequently served with something starchy, French fries or potato salad, another potato dish, rice, or, especially when eating it on the go, between 2 slices of bread as a sandwich called rízekvchlebu. And that brings us back to, well, us. So I made a bunch of řízek, simply pounding pieces of pork butt flat, breading and frying them. And I made sandwiches with them, using good rye sourdough, mayonnaise, a brown Czech mustard, and garlicky dill pickles. I wrapped them up in butcher's paper, and when this Chicago January managed to string together a few 40-degree days in a row, I even took one on a hike. Or, that is, a walk through the forest preserve. Simple sandwiches rely on the quality of their ingredients, and while these may not have stood the scrutiny of a Czech babička, they did satisfy my palate. A breaded, fried pork cutlet, simply seasoned, is a universal delight, from the tenderloins of Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana to the tonkatsu of Japan. These were no exception. Dressed with black pepper and lemon juice, with pickles and mayonnaise and good brown mustard, the simple salt seasoning of the breading was no detriment to their flavor. Pork butt is a fattier, tastier, and chewier piece of meat than a tenderloin or a pork chop. And despite being pounded flat, these were less than perfectly tender, but in a good way. Al dente, I suppose you might say. Which brings us back to Italy. Although perhaps not quite fully returning us to our shipwrecked 4th century Saint Satyrus, where we began.